At the intersection of Chongqing South Road and Katagulan Boulevard in Taipei, stands a Baroque-style building over a century old. This 5-story red brick structure with a central tower was begun in June 1912 and completed in March 1919. It became a symbol of Japan's colonial rule over Taiwan. Every successive governor-general governed Taiwan from this building. On December 30, 1944, Andō Rikichi, newly promoted to general in the Imperial Japanese Army, took over from Hasegawa Kiyoshi. Holding civil, legislative, judicial, and military power, he was known as a local emperor. Less than a year after taking office, Japan surrendered. The High and Mighty Governor-General's office became a detention site for Japanese prisoners. Andō Rikichi, the local emperor, presided over the end of Japan's colonial rule in Taiwan. Xiamen lies 165 nautical miles from Kaohsiung Harbor. In early winter of 1945, Xiamen enjoyed mild autumn weather. From early September, when preparations began in Xiamen for the Handover mission, Li Yupang and the Taiwan Volunteer Corps and Youth Corps had been waiting here for 2 full months. On this day, the rented ship was finally ready to depart.
There were no naval escorts, nothing at all. So, my father went and hired a regular civilian boat, pretty much the same kind of boat people use for fishing.
The boat was built in 1938. On the day it was completed, Japan occupied Xiamen. The owner named it Huaguang, expressing the hope that the Chinese people would reclaim their lost land. At 3 p.m. on November 7, 1945, more than 120 members of the Taiwan Volunteer Corps boarded the Huaguang boat, heading to Taiwan to take part in the post-war takeover. The Huaguang boat set off at full speed into the open sea. A few hours after departure, the weather changed. Battered by violent storms, the boat was violently tossed. 15 members of the Taiwan Volunteer Corps died. The Handover mission was forced to stop.
There was a shipwreck. More than 10 people died. At the memorial service, I remember it very clearly. The obituary took about 5 minutes to read, but my father read it for nearly 30. He could not get through it. That shows how deeply he cared for his men.
On the day the Huaguang boat met disaster, a southbound train was departing from Taipei Station. Having learned the day before he would take over Kaohsiung, with no time for further preparation, She Tungmin packed lightly and hurried onto the train.
We often say officials don't govern their places of origin. It's a tradition. Someone from Taichung should not govern Taichung. They must be assigned elsewhere. That is to say, following this line of reasoning, because Mr. She was from Taichung, having him take over Taichung went against the tradition in Chinese officialdom. He must go elsewhere.
Originally assigned to Taichung, She was reassigned at the last moment to Kaohsiung. Under Japanese rule, Taiwan's divisions changed 9 times, resulting in 5 prefectures and 3 offices. The 5 prefectures lay along Taiwan's west coast: Taipei, Hsinchu, Taichung, Tainan, and Kaohsiung. The 3 offices referred to Taitung and Hualien, in eastern Taiwan, and Penghu in the Taiwan Strait. Not long after passing Taichung, the train carrying She Tungmin stopped at Air Shui in Zhonghua, his hometown. He reunited with the elders and villagers he had not seen for 20 years.
Seeing each other again after 20 years, you can imagine it. They must have hugged each other and burst into tears. You can definitely picture the scene. The local gentry in Ershui were also overjoyed. It gave them that feeling like their sons had finally come back home, triumphant and honored. It was beyond words.
The train stopped at Ershui station for only 10 minutes. Hardly having spoken with his elderly parents, She and his party said farewell and continued south. The scenery kept changing as thoughts raced endlessly. Recalling more than 20 years and 6 months ago, I left resolved never to live under foreign rule. Now I return in joy, stepping once again onto my homeland soil. 50 years ago, my grandfather witnessed Japan's occupation of Taiwan. And today, I witnessed the Japanese being driven from Taiwan. Looking back and ahead, how can I not be overwhelmed with excitement? On the morning of his second day in Kaohsiung, from Takahara, the outgoing prefectural governor, She took over Taiwan.
Today, I, in my capacity as chairman of the Kaohsiung Prefecture Takeover Committee, formally take over the local government of Kaohsiung Prefecture from the Japanese authorities. I sincerely ask everyone serving in the prefectural offices, whether Taiwanese or Japanese, to continue performing their duties as usual. The first task was to inventory land, buildings, negotiable securities, and real estate. All government assets had to be fully accounted for, with proper registers. Our national government personnel would do the inspection. Only after that could the handover procedure be considered finished and brought to a proper close.
As the transfer of assets began, Takahara, the outgoing prefectural governor, handed over more than 700,000 yen. Was that all that remained of a prefecture as vast as Kaohsiung? She Tungmin's expression suddenly turned grave.
My late father could tell that what Takahara was saying was far from the truth. Something must be concealed, which made him angry. Feeling his rage, Governor Takahara became very anxious.
In fear of punishment, Takahara produced all the account books and then handed over more than 2 million yen. While She was taking over Kaohsiung Prefecture, another Taiwanese, Lin Chintung, was overseeing the takeover of Taipei Prefecture. Lin recalled that during the takeover, the local officials were almost all Japanese. with Taiwanese rarely holding even minor posts.
When Chun first arrived in Taiwan, he held a strong sense of purpose. He carefully selected his governing team, appointing Taiwanese as mayor of Taipei, mayor of Kaohsiung, and magistrate of Hsinchu County.
Shi Renyang, who assisted Lin Chentong in the takeover of Taipei Prefecture, wrote in his memoirs, "At the Restoration's start, the takeover was widely seen as a genuine return of power, and people rejoiced and turned toward the motherland."
At the time, Taiwan had one newspaper, with a Taiwanese publisher, and one radio station, led by a Taiwanese director. Controlling such propaganda apparatuses would never have happened to the Taiwanese under Japanese rule.
Under the Governor General's office, Taiwanese were excluded from appointments. During Japan's 50-year rule, not a single prefectural governor, bureau chief, or city mayor was Taiwanese. At the lowest administrative levels, such as street chiefs and village heads, nearly all posts were held by Japanese. After the surrender ceremony, the Governor General's office lost its authority. Taiwan's last Governor General, Andō Rikichi, was reassigned to head the liaison office for Japanese troops in Taiwan. Military takeover operations then began. On November 17, 1945, a fleet of the Allies, carrying soldiers of the National Revolutionary Army, departed from Haiphong, Vietnam.
We left almost at a moment's notice. When we set out, we brought no heavy equipment. I was in an artillery battalion, and we didn't even bring our guns.
He Jiyuan, a Huanpu Military Academy graduate, served as a deputy company commander of an artillery battalion of National Revolutionary Army. He remembered that right after the surrender ceremony in Vietnam, he was suddenly ordered to Taiwan for the takeover. After 4 days and nights of rough seas, they crossed the vast ocean and arrived at Kaohsiung Harbor.
When we landed in Kaohsiung, Taiwanese compatriots were right there at the docks, lining up along the way to welcome us. People beat gongs, played drums, and set off firecrackers. Among the people, there were also some Japanese generals, about 10 of them, I think, who had come with the group to greet and receive us. But their expressions were nothing like the welcoming ones of the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese were smiling. The Japanese were not.
After the 62nd Army landed in Kaohsiung, he did not take part in takeover duties as expected. His artillery battalion was assigned to train at a primary school in Tainan. There, they sang songs with teachers and students, in a warm atmosphere.
We sang songs from the War of Resistance. We sang March of the Volunteers, which is today's national anthem. We also sang the Broadsword March,
Also arriving at that time, Zhang Zhixian, a battalion commander of the 62nd Army of the National Revolutionary Army, was sent to an arsenal in Kaohsiung for takeover duties.
There was no sabotage. Everything was intact, with nothing damaged or missing. We simply inspected and received the inventory. How many machine guns? How many rounds per crate? Everything was checked, verified, and formally received in the depot.
One month earlier, departing from Ningbo in 2 waves and landing at Keelung Harbor. The 70th Army carried out a military takeover in northern Taiwan.
Troops stationed in Taipei handled the takeover. The Japanese handed over their weapons. Every single ship docked at the harbor was gathered up and registered together in one go.
We took over the entire warehouse. All the weapons were stored there. After that, our unit was assigned specifically to guard the weapons.
Every weapon and round of ammunition was neatly laid out on the ground. Japanese troops stood beside them and saluted us. Company to company, battalion to battalion, the handover was conducted with salutes. There was no resistance at all.
The military takeover went smoothly. There was no resistance. And all weapons were well preserved. In fact, a Chinese directive to Japanese forces in Taiwan was issued on October 6. All Japanese Army, Navy and Air Force in Taiwan province, along with their weapons, equipment, vessels, vehicles, transportation and communications facilities, airfields, harbors and related assets, must be preserved intact, submitted upon order, and must not be concealed, abandoned, or damaged.
The Dan River served as the dividing line. The Dan River lies north of Taichung. That conclusion is drawn in terms of current administrative divisions. What was north of the river was taken over by the 70th Army. It was split into 2 routes. One advanced from Taipei south to Hsinchu, while the other moved toward Ilan. That was the 70th Army's area. South of the Dan River was the 62nd Army. That area was much larger. It stretched from Taichung to Pingdong, and even extended to Taitung in eastern Taiwan. It was taken over by the 62nd Army.
Over the 2 months following, mid-October 1945, National Revolutionary Army ground, naval and air forces slowly controlled Taiwan's fortresses, harbors, and airfields. Japanese forces in Taipei were disarmed, the fastest, completed in 3 days.
The Japanese had many weapons. Each of us was issued a Japanese pistol to carry out the takeover. Those weapons were probably not even inventoried. Anyway, in the army, they handed out those pistols, making sure that every single captain got issued one.
We arrived carrying Chiang Kai-shek rifles, the Hanyang-made ones. Once we got there, they were replaced at once. Brand new, sniper-style rifles, small and compact. The Japanese had clearly never used them.
The disarmament resulted in 170,000 captives. Without centralized management, these Japanese captives could come into conflict with local people. The Taiwan Garrison Command ordered all Japanese captives confined locally, without unauthorized movement.
The Japanese military enforced colonial violence in Taiwan. Local Taiwanese harbored deep resentment toward them. By that time, Japan had surrendered, and the soldiers had disarmed. If they were allowed to mix with civilians and local residents, conflicts could easily arise. That would hinder the subsequent takeover and transition. That is why captive camps were established to manage them.
In addition to receiving weapons, the troops also maintained local order to prevent unrest. After decades of Japanese colonial rule in Taiwan, the Taiwanese remained highly vigilant against such risks. Some Japanese seemed compliant, but had hidden intentions, so we stayed alert and remained vigilant.
Although Japanese forces had been disarmed, their remaining influence was considerable. The Taiwan Provincial Administrative Executive Office warned, the police remain under Japanese control. Our takeover personnel and troops are limited. Though they are like bombs without fuses, we must remain cautious in case they suddenly explode. After completing systematic training in Fujian, all trainees of the Taiwan Police Cadre Training Program began taking over police duties.
In Taiwan, there were 12,800 police officers. But the number of personnel sent from the police academy, including both teachers and students, was only over 1,000. All the personnel were assigned to key areas. Some places received more personnel, others fewer, depending on priority. This photo was taken after I arrived in Taiwan. This is a close classmate of mine.
Xing Han was born in 1924 in Yancheng, Jiangsu. In December 1944, he was admitted to Taiwan Police Cadre Training Program. After Japan's surrender, Xing and his classmates were ordered to take over Taiwan's police affairs.
There was an institute that was called Taiwan Provincial Takeover Management Committee. I served as an administrator, responsible for receiving Japanese records and ledgers, as well as buildings, offices, uniforms, and funds. I was in charge of those ledgers. The blankets we received from the Japanese turned out to be surprisingly high quality, much better than expected. The firefighting equipment we received, including fire engines, was also intact. There was no damage.
The police takeover went smoothly. In addition to the transfer of property, land, buildings, facilities, weapons, equipment, and records, another critical issue was retaining Taiwanese police officers.
The number of takeover personnel was small, just over 1,000. Under the system of 5 prefectures and 3 offices, we had 8 units. That meant a little over 100 people per unit. In Hsinchu Prefecture, we didn't even have 100 people. There was no way to reach every police substation.
There were hundreds of police officers in Taiwan back then, possibly over 1,000, all lower-ranking ones. We tried to retain as many as possible, and then gave them another 3 months of training. Later, I was transferred to the Police Training Institute. The institute trained the retained Taiwanese policemen.
This photo was taken on November 22, 1945. A 9-person team took over the Zhonghua Police Department. The 9 people in light uniforms in the front row are takeover personnel. Those in dark uniforms and others in light uniforms are Japanese police and Taiwanese auxiliary officers. They outnumbered the 9-person takeover team by several times. Under Japanese rule, Taiwan's police force numbered as many as 12,800, most of whom were Japanese. Taiwanese were limited to ordinary auxiliary roles. The inequality was not only reflected in uniforms.
There was actually a difference in how they were addressed. Japanese police weren't referred to simply as police. They were called kibo. It was a term combining police and arrest. However, Taiwanese policemen were not allowed to be called kibo, as the Japanese were. They were called kaiboshu, meaning hands assisting the police. It was nothing but contempt, looking down on the Taiwanese.
Under Japanese rule, all Taiwanese had no political rights. Taiwanese policemen were limited to low-ranking posts. High-ranking posts were never held by any Taiwanese. Among those senior, administrative positions, there were never Taiwanese. Also, in the judicial system, in courts of justice, the Taiwanese could only serve as clerks or similar roles.
Under Japanese rule, police power was immense. As the saying went, even a crying child would fall silent. Taiwanese people called the Japanese police sir. Mothers would frighten crying children by saying, "The sir is coming." The child would immediately quiet down.
The police were what people feared most. They directly controlled people's everyday lives. Police authority was overwhelming. When a police officer approached, people would say, "The police are here." Everyone would instantly behave, stand straight, and feel frightened. Their punishments were severe, along with very harsh tones. Very intense. A slap could leave you reeling, then forced to stand straight. Another slap would follow. That left a deep impression.
Once inside, you address them as sir. "Sir, my name is so-and-so. I'm here." You would be trembling, afraid to sit. You knelt on the ground to answer.
Xing Han, Zhang Minchang, and Wan Chuanfa were all trainees in the Taiwan Police Cadre Training Program. Similarly, the arrival of 1,001 trainees from the program laid the basis for early post-war policing in Taiwan. Japanese police, along with colonial rule, withdrew from Taiwan's historical stage. After a shipwreck and staying in Xiamen for over a month, Li Yupang led the Taiwan Volunteer Corps and Youth Corps to set out again, finally arriving in Taiwan on December 8, 1945.
With insufficient military and police presence, maintaining public order became problematic. Administrative efficiency was bad too, so my father assisted the government, saying he would handle certain matters. It was assistance in nature. The items he helped take over were houses and dormitories. There was no resistance because the Japanese knew they were in the wrong. They had been defeated, and they also knew that Taiwan did not belong to Japan.
Japanese asset takeover expanded. Film director Pai Ko took over the film production and screening organizations left by the Japanese colonial authorities. He merged them into the Taiwan Film Studio.
When my father came to Taiwan to take over the equipment left by the Japanese, it was called by the Japanese the IGA Association. Taiwan's IGA Association. IGA is a Japanese term for film. There was very little equipment left. The best item was a French-made 16mm camera. The processing equipment was also basic.
The footage of Taiwan, right after its restoration, was actually recorded by Pai Ko after he completed the takeover. That is why he is called the witness to Taiwan's restoration and a pioneer of Taiwanese cinema.
At the time of restoration, people from the Chinese mainland knew very little about Taiwan. No one had been there. No one had seen it. That was why Pai Ko filmed 4 episodes in total. Together, these 4 documentaries were titled Today's Taiwan. They were screened publicly in Nanjing and Shanghai, and became the public's first direct exposure to what Taiwan was like. Unfortunately, none of them can be found today.
Meanwhile, Taiwan Provincial Administrative Executive Office had to repatriate Japanese people. After September 9, 1945, over 3 million Japanese captives and civilians in China awaited repatriation. Of these, nearly 500,000 needed to be repatriated from Taiwan. Once high-ranking colonial rulers, the Japanese overnight became prisoners and expatriates. Their status collapsed completely. This is a monument in Jian Township, Hualien. It records in detail the history of Japanese colonial settlement there. "15 years after Japan seized Taiwan, groups of Japanese set out from their homeland and arrived by ship in Hualien, beginning their lives as state-sponsored colonial settlers. This old photo shows Japanese settlers being ferried ashore by boats when they arrived at Hualien Harbor.
After they came, they began developing the land in eastern Taiwan. 3 government-sponsored settlement villages were established in the Hualien area. The first was Yoshino Village. More than 85% of the residents were from the Yoshino River area in Japan, so the settlement was named Yoshino Village.
Viewed from above today, Jian Township has replaced the former Yoshino village. However, its layout still preserves the grid-style planning of the Japanese colonial period. After Taiwan's restoration, Japanese residents who had lived here were all repatriated.
The final village head was Nishimura Kenshi. One of his descendants came to visit once. When we visited his former home, we noticed a main pillar. The pillar was an unprocessed wooden log. It had been cut through, in the middle. The middle section had been taken away. Later, we learned what happened to the pillar. They considered the pillar of the house meaningful and took it back to Japan to be kept by his descendants. The message was, someday, bring this pillar back to Taiwan and reinstall it. He believed that one day he would return.
This is the pillar cut through in the middle. Today, it still hangs prominently inside the house. Unwilling to accept their defeat, Nishimura clung to the hope of returning to Taiwan. He believed the pillar would allow him to reclaim his former home. But Japan's surrender was an unchangeable reality. Nishimura's dream was never fulfilled. The repatriation of 500,000 Japanese people was a massive and complex operation. How to organize the repatriation in batches in 5 months. How to arrange the related routes and vessels. A series of pressing issues demanded solutions.
Yes, that was a big task that both the Chinese government and the Japanese government faced, but particularly the Chinese government, because it would take some time to organize them, to organize shipping, transport, and to keep them fed, and to keep peace.
The roster for the repatriation of Japanese civilians from Taiwan province shows the repatriation of Japanese people was orderly, by unit and batch, with northern residents sent to Keelung Harbor, and southern ones to Kaohsiung Harbor. Those in eastern Taiwan left from Hualien Harbor and sailed back to Japan.
North, the 70th Army. South, the 62nd Army. They had to secure the landing areas militarily. and keep Japanese forces under control. Within 3 months, they managed to concentrate thousands and tens of thousands of Japanese troops in major cities. They then transported them to Keelung Harbor and Kaohsiung Harbor. All of these were completed in order.
Japanese civilians were gathered at Kaohsiung Harbor. Aside from just over 100 shipping workers, Japanese civilians vanished from the streets. It has never been the case in 50 years, making the force of history impossible to ignore. This was written by a Taiwanese writer, Wu Xinrong, who witnessed the repatriation firsthand. On March 13, 1946, Chen Yi, Governor-General of Taiwan Province and Garrison Commander-in-Chief, flew from Taipei to Chongqing for a meeting. At a press conference, he disclosed the progress of repatriation. Half of the captives had been repatriated. 319,808 civilians were scheduled to be sent back by the end of April 1946.
Enormous numbers of Japanese were repatriated. Some returned from Korea, some from Southeast Asia, and others from Taiwan. Taiwan had been under what the Japanese called the Southern Affairs section of the Home Ministry. After Japan was defeated in the War of Resistance, it transferred Taiwan-related affairs to what they called the Foreign Ministry.
In April 2015, the production team of Taiwan 1945 traveled to Japan. After twists and turns, they located a former Japanese civilian, Muratomi Takehiko, at a dojo in Fukuoka. Muratomi Takehiko was born in Taichung in 1931. People like him, who were born and raised in Taiwan, but repatriated to Japan after the war, are known as wansei.
Since our original plan was to settle in Taiwan for good, leaving Taiwan had never crossed our minds. Our journey began with a bus ride from Taichung to Miaoli, followed by a train from Miaoli to Keelung. From Keelung, we were repatriated to Japan.
These warehouses at Keelung Harbor were quarantine facilities. Every Japanese captive and civilian had to undergo quarantine here.
Before boarding, they underwent a physical exam. In line with international quarantine rules, they accepted health checks and vaccinations. If problems were found, they were transferred to an army hospital. They would not be sent back home before they were healed. This way, it eradicated the possibility of communicable diseases during the cruise.
In April 1946, after quarantine and inspection, Muratomi's family boarded a transport ship.
Because we were inside the ship, I barely knew what was going on. What I do remember, however, is that we encountered a typhoon on the way. We had a very tough time, because, in the end, every single one of us started feeling horribly seasick from the non-stop, violent jolts and relentless rocking of the ship.
Like Muratomi Takehiko, everyone on the ship was allowed to carry 1,000 yen in cash, a small amount of food, daily necessities equal to 2 knapsacks, and 2 pieces of luggage, each weighing up to 30 kilograms.
The regulations were detailed. They had forms listing what was allowed and what was not. In particular, valuable items such as gold, silver, pearls, agate, and other valuables were strictly forbidden. Only 1 fountain pen was allowed. Only 1 watch was permitted. Everything was specified in detail.
It was extremely rare that captives and civilians of a defeated country were allowed to return with clothes, bedding, food, as well as cash. Their health was also well kept. Back then, you hardly ever saw measures like this being put in place anywhere else in the world.
In Sasebo City, northern Nagasaki, Japan, there is a Hikiage Memorial Museum, built to commemorate the repatriation after the war. In Japanese, Hikiage means return voyage or coming home. The Hikiage Memorial Museum holds extensive photos and materials showing Japanese captives and civilians being repatriated after the war.
This picture shows the location, serving as the gathering and departure point before going to Hanosaki Station. This one shows the scene of people carrying all their belongings, getting ready to set out on their journey in the direction of Hanosaki Station.
It was extremely hard. During that time, while traveling alongside my uncle, we faced a succession of considerable hardships and encountered numerous challenges throughout our journey. At the time, Japan itself was a country grappling with profound poverty. Within the context of severe poverty characterizing the era, the desperate struggle for survival often manifested in the distressing and frequent act of individuals seizing possessions from others.
Guided by principles of forgiveness and goodwill, the Chinese government allowed them to take essential belongings. But their life in Japan was reduced to an extreme dilemma. Japan's aggression towards China not only brought suffering to the Chinese people, but also caused hardship to Japanese civilians.
There must never be another war. I believe in peace, and see myself as a pacifist.
The year 2015 is the 70th anniversary of Japan's defeat. Honestly speaking, for the majority of Japanese people, World War II is simply one where Japan was attacked. Since Hiroshima and Nagasaki were raided by atomic bombs, and 200,000 people were killed in the Tokyo air raids. In other words, many Japanese people reflect on what happened 70 years ago, primarily from the perspective of being victims. In some ways, that perspective is actually understandable, but very few people reflect on what Japan did from the standpoint of being perpetrators. Tens of millions of people died in the Chinese mainland, and an enormous number of civilians in Korea, the Philippines, and other Southeast Asian countries lost their lives in the aggression of Japan.
On December 23, 1945, the first batch of repatriation began. By May 31, 1946, 500,000 Japanese people in Taiwan were repatriated, except for some essential Japanese scholars and technicians. Around the same time, most Japanese captives and civilians across the Chinese mainland were also repatriated as scheduled.
And one observation is that there's virtually no record of any kind of revenge being taken by the public or individuals against Japanese soldiers or Japanese civilians. So a remarkable evidence of the lack of this sort of anger temperament, the Chinese ability to treat the civilians and the soldiers with some respect until they left.
Japan committed grave crimes in East and Southeast Asia. Chinese troops, other Asian forces, and ordinary people deeply hated them. However, the Chinese military strictly followed humanitarian principles. Captives were repatriated, and other civilians were peacefully returned, as required by the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. I believe this reflects a core value of Chinese culture, treating others with goodwill.
On April 15, 1946, Andō Rikichi, as a war criminal, was escorted to Shanghai and imprisoned at Lan Chao prison. 4 nights later, Andō Rikichi took his own life by poisoning. On Chinese soil, Andō Rikichi was the highest-ranking Japanese general who invaded China. His death symbolized the collapse of Japan's 50-year rule over Taiwan and its imperial ambitions. Colonial plunder and the devastation of war left Taiwan's economy on the brink of collapse. Ports, railways, plants, and sugar mills were destroyed. How would Taiwan's governors achieve financial self-sufficiency? How would it mobilize the public to rebuild the economy? Please stay tuned for the 6-episode historical documentary, Taiwan, 1945, Episode 4, Revival and Reconstruction.